What up, everybody? This is Chef, New Zealand Murder History Podcast. That's my flax bush. And Maori say harakiki. Anyway, let's set this up. I've got a pretty crazy story to tell you today. When I say pretty crazy, I mean it's really disturbing. Anyone who's already having a bad day, maybe don't watch it, or especially anyone who's ever been involved in a mass shooting. I don't know if I've got viewers over in America or over here in New Zealand who have been in something like that. If you have, don't watch this episode because it's extremely triggering anyway. The internet sources used was Raurimu killer back in custody, and that was on the 9th of July 2011. Found that one on stuff.co.nz. There was also a really awesome podcast on this called Case 18, the Raurimu Rampage, and it's only available through True Crime New Zealand NZ podcast, and that's on their website, truecrimenz.com. Yeah, so that was released on May 12, 2020. There was heaps of other ones I read as well. There was Raurimu 20 years on, and anyway, yeah. So not suitable for children. Definitely not. This is about New Zealand mass shootings. This podcast does not intend on causing offence to any of the victims or even the shooters. I'm filming this podcast for education about the dangers of firearms, etc., New Zealand life and life in general. Also, if you think you might find this triggering or upsetting, please click off. I'm going to discuss the Raurimu 1997 shooting at length and some other ones too. Welcome to New Zealand Murder History Podcast. Now, in no particular order, here's some of New Zealand's worst mass shootings. Stephen Anderson was and still is a paranoid schizophrenic from Wellington City. In 1997, he was smoking heaps of DAC and losing his marbles. His parents, Helen and Neville Anderson, owned a lodge in Raurimu. That's just south of the Central Plateau district. I actually thought it was Central Plateau. It turns out it's North Manawatu. Anyway, you get the picture. It's not far from Mount Ruapehu. Which, for those of you who are not from New Zealand, that's bang in the middle of the North Island of New Zealand. Anyway, Neville Anderson, Stephen Anderson's dad, built a family lodge up there in 1991. It was completed. Now fast forward to Waitangi weekend, the 8th of February 1997. And the Andersons were concerned for their son Stephen, 24 at the time, deciding to take him to the lodge for Waitangi rather than leave him at home alone. They invited friends of theirs from Kandala, Wellington, to come stay, as they often did. Neville Anderson had been given 6 months to live due to leukemia diagnosis, but he wouldn't even get that far, unfortunately. So in the lodge there was the Anderson family plus 4 couples, Isabel and Anthony McCarty, Raymond and Eve Spencer, Gordon and Andrea Brander, Stephen Hansen, Michelle Churton, also single bloke John Matthews. And all the couples were getting ready for breakfast, sitting around the table, drinking coffees, when Stephen Anderson walked in, with a stern look on his face, telling the happy partygoers that he'd been having sex with a dog and a cat. His mum Helen was horrified and told her son to go wash up and get ready for breakfast. Stephen came back with a 12-gauge shotgun. His dad, to his credit, exclaimed, "What are you doing, Stephen?" trying to wrestle the gun. But the 60-year-old man with terminal cancer was no match for a psychotic young buck with a shotgun. Stephen yelled out, "You're the devil incarnate," shooting Neville down with a single blast from the single-barreled weapon. I mean, this is messed up, and isn't it crazy how the most evil people seem to think other people are the devil or other people are evil? I mean, he's the only one who's being the devil incarnate that day. It's ridiculous. Anyway. Yeah, so he shoots him with the shotgun. But it was a valiant effort, really, from Neville. I mean, you know, he did the best he could. The panicked holiday goers made a dash for it. Getting hit in the mayhem was highly likely. However, not all would be killed. Isabel McCarty and her husband made it out, but didn't know Stephen Anderson was right behind them. Isabel took a blast to her back. She blacked out, waking up to her husband lying next to her. She later stated that it was obvious he was dead. Blood was pouring from his head like someone had turned on a tap. Isabel would survive the injuries. She would later say in court that she wouldn't have gone on the trip if she knew Stephen Anderson was going to be there. I felt very uncomfortable around him. And when we came to the lodge, Helen Anderson said sorry, we had to bring Stephen. I was going to leave him in Wellington, but he's been unwell lately. So I asked the neighbours to feed the cat. Yeah, I don't reckon I'd let Stephen Anderson feed my cat either. Raymond Spencer was shot in the face as he jumped into some bushes. Michelle Churton managed to hide, stuffing her t-shirt in her mouth so as to silence her heavy breathing. Back inside the lodge, Andrea Brander and John Matthews were dead from gunshot wounds, along with Neville Anderson, Stephen's dad. Lying dead by the telephone was John Matthews. The bloody phone in his hand had the cop on the other end of the line. "Talk to me, mate, what's going on?" The voice on the phone crackled out into the silence of the early morning. Meanwhile, next door, the neighbours, well, they were having a nice quiet morning. Henk and Helena van der Wetterling were the owners of the house next door to the lodge, and they were enjoying a visit from their son Rod and his wife Kim and their two daughters, a 2-year-old and a baby. The van der Wetterlings were getting the car ready to go to Lake Taupo. Lake Taupo, sorry, I'll pronounce that correctly. Anyway, they were going to Lake Taupo to watch some boat race. When they heard the shots, at first they thought nothing of it, assumed it was just some duck hunters or something. Then Helen Anderson jumped their fence, saying there had been a shooting and people were dead. Rod and Henk, the dad and son, ran up to the lodge. Henk van der Wetterling went to help the victims, and Rod went to call the cops. He hurried to put his rifle together. Kim, his wife, runs up to the road, and Helen Anderson is now in the car with Rod and Kim's kids, and Kim and Rod's mum. Yeah, and Rod jumps in the driver's seat. So he's got his rifle with him, and he goes to reverse up the drive when Stephen Anderson appears at the top of the drive with his shotgun. Rod drives back towards the house, trying to get his family out of range of the gun. He was unable to park the car behind the house. The gate was locked. So Rod does the only thing he can do. He jumps out of the car, and with his rifle, he faces off with Stephen Anderson. "Back off, back off, back off!" Stephen Anderson dropped to the ground all of a sudden. Rod, still holding the rifle, took one step closer, and Stephen Anderson lifted the shotgun, shooting Rod in the side of the face. Rod's a tough bloke, though, jumping up and running with Stephen Anderson chasing him. Rod thought he was going to die that day, but at least the madman was chasing him, and hopefully his family in the car would be okay. Stephen took a few shots and then he went back up to the top of the road. Up at the road, Rod's wife Kim and his dad Henk flagged down a logging truck. Greg Wood was the logging truck driver, Wanganui truck driver Greg Wood. I know, isn't it ridiculous? The bloke driving the logging truck is actually called Greg Wood. It's like Greg Cement driving a concrete mixer. Anyway, he could hardly believe what Kim and Henk Wetterling were telling him. Greg Wood was trying to call for help on his radio, on his truck radio, but there was no reception. Glancing in the mirror, he was absolutely horrified to see Stephen Anderson creeping up the side of his truck, reloading his shotgun. Greg Wood was unarmed and did the best thing he could. He threw his truck into gear and drove out of there. Henk was shot twice, one shot to drop him and then a headshot to finish the job. Kim just stood there catatonic with fear. Stephen lined her up with his shotgun when, for some reason, he spares her life, lowering the weapon and making a run for it. Meanwhile, Rod van der Wetterling is covered in blood running up the Raurimu spiral. Now, what is the Raurimu spiral, you ask? Well, it's a piece of engineering to be proud of. Railway tracks that spiral up and over a 139-metre hill. And the cops found him collapsed at the top of the spiral. He was rushed to Palmerston North Hospital, where his life was saved. By now, a massive police presence has descended on the small town, armed defenders squad and a chopper as well. The chopper spotted Stephen Anderson running naked without his beloved shotgun. "Get on the ground, face down!" Stephen ran off laughing. The chopper circled around to confront Stephen again. "Get down now!" The cop shouted, brandishing his rifle this time. Stephen Anderson hit the deck, and the cop actually jumps out of the helicopter, Rambo style, pinning Stephen Anderson to the ground. And by now the armed offenders squad were there too to assist Rambo Copper in the arrest. The madness was over. The Raurimu shooter murderous hands were cuffed and he was taken to Taumarunui police station in the chopper. In the interview in the station, Stephen would say, "It's a long story," also saying that he shot his dad because he was disguised as dog and that dog was God backwards. He told the cops some of the victims begged for their lives. The cops first charged Stephen Anderson with one murder. Now that's a holding charge. By the time he went up in the High Court in Hamilton, he was facing 6 murder charges and 4 attempt murder for the 10 people he shot. A jury found him not guilty by reasons of insanity. Declared a special patient, Steve Anderson, the Raurimu shooter, was committed to Porirua Psych Forensics. He would do 12 years before being released in 2009. I think that was way too soon, but I always think that. I mean, here in New Zealand, we don't lock people up forever. I mean, that's great, but anyway, as far as I know, the only person who's locked up forever is the Christchurch mosque shooter. He's declared too dangerous to release. But anyway, Stephen Anderson gets released in 2009, but 2 years later he gets recalled because he was suspected of smoking synthetic cannabis, which is probably even worse for schizophrenics than the real thing. He was briefly hired as an art teacher at Inverlochy art school, but then when they found out about his past, they had to let him go. And that's the story of Stephen Anderson and the Raurimu shooting. And now I'm going to talk about Aramawana, which was another mass shooting where David Gray basically went ballistic down in a town called Aramawana, just south of Dunedin there on the coastline, and he shot 14 people, or was it 13? I think he killed 13 but shot 14 people, and that was a mess. They actually made a movie about it called Out of the Blue, which I would recommend. It's very good. But yeah, like I said, I'm not going to do a whole podcast on Aramoana. It's well documented on the internet already. But yeah, New Zealand. We get a few mass shootings over here. You know, yeah, not as many as the States, but, you know, we get one or two, you know. Have a good day, everybody.